Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the McGowan Theater located in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. I'm Doug Swanson. I'm the Visitor Services Manager for the National Archives Museum, as well as the producer for the Noontime Lecture Series. Before we begin today's program, I'd like to remind you of a couple other programs that will be taking place at this location in the near future. On Thursday, October 26th at 7 p.m., we will hold the second annual McGowan Forum on Ethics, the Challenge of Big Data. A panel of writers, corporate leaders, and government officials will discuss the ethical responsibility of those who compile and track citizens' personal data. Then on Monday, October 30th at noon, Professor Joseph Janes will discuss his book, Documents That Change the Way We Live, and a book signing will follow that program. To find out more about these, our other programs, and our exhibits, please visit our website at www.archives.gov/calendar. You'll also find some printed materials about upcoming programs in the theater lobby. Our topic for today is We Have Not a Government, the Articles of Confederation and the Road to the Constitution by Dr. George William Van Cleve. George William Van Cleve is research professor in law and history at the Seattle University of Law School. He has a PhD in history from the University of Virginia and a JD from Harvard Law School. He is the author of We Have Not a Government and has written on the Constitution and slavery in an earlier book, A Slaveholders' Union, Slavery, Politics, and the Constitution in the Early American Republic. He's also published about a dozen book chapters and law and history journal articles. He's taught as an adjunct faculty member at the University of Virginia and 4 law schools. He's also previously been honored as the honorary visiting professor at the University of Kent, Canterbury, UK. So please join me in welcoming Dr. George William Van Cleve to the National Archives.
Good afternoon. First of all, let me thank you for coming today. I appreciate it. I'd like to thank Doug Swanson for that kind introduction. The National Archives is one of our nation's most valuable institutions, and I'm honored to have a chance to talk with you here about my book, We Have Not a Government. Before I begin the talk, I want to say just a few words of thanks to the folks who have supported me over the several years that it took to research and write this book, particularly my wife, Mary, and my family, whose love and support were really indispensable to the work, and to my mentors, Professor Peter Onuf, Dr. Max Edling of the UK, and the late Richard Beeman, whose book, Plain Honest Men, about the Constitutional Convention was actually very helpful to me in planning my book that I'm going to talk about today. So let me start with a quick overview of the book. In 1783, the United States had just triumphed in the Revolutionary War. That victory was won under a central government formed by the Articles of Confederation. I'm going to call that government the Confederation in the talk today. The Confederation was fairly popular then, and few people wanted to make major changes in it. But just 4 years later, in 1787, the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention jettisoned the Confederation government for a radically different government under our current Constitution, a government that was dramatically more powerful. And many people were shocked and unhappy when this happened. How and why did that happen? My book answers those questions. On a personal note, I started working on this book a few years ago because of an argument between Alexander Hamilton and James Madison that I just could not understand. It turns out that in 1783, when Alexander Hamilton was in Congress, he had been sent there, he thought, to try to get Congress to authorize a national convention to reform the Articles of Confederation. His main opponent was James Madison. And I just could not understand why Hamilton and Madison, who 4 years later were such firm allies in creating the Constitutional Convention, and Hamilton was enormously instrumental in getting the convention authorized in New York, as my book discusses in detail. I could not understand why these people had been complete opponents 4 years earlier, and that was really the reason that I began the research for this book. And then one of the things my book does, actually, is to explain why that took place. Now, the conventional wisdom about politics in this period was that it was mostly economic class warfare. It supposedly pitted wealthy men against emerging popular state democratic movements seeking greater political and economic equality. In that view, the 1787 Constitution was really a conservative counter-revolution intended to suppress those popular movements. My book argues instead that the post-war period is best viewed as a tale of the failures of the Confederation, often due to sectional conflicts or state self-interest, which led to a political crisis. Here's a quick preview of my answers about why the Articles were discarded. The period just after the Revolutionary War was a period of major political disruption. It was a period of severe economic recession. It was a time of sharp sectional conflict, and it was a time of considerable social unrest. The Confederation and the 13 state governments faced extremely difficult challenges in responding to these major stresses on the United States. The Confederation became stalemated on many major issues that faced it during this period, and it was unable to enforce its laws and treaties. Many states did little better. The 1787 Constitution was a direct response to these government failures. It was a success for people such as George Washington, who had been advocating major reforms since the end of the Revolutionary War, not a counter-revolution. Please join me now in taking a closer look at this tumultuous period. And today, unfortunately, my time is such that I'll only be able to give some illustrations of the kinds of issues that I discuss in my book, but I think it's fair to say that I cover pretty much the major ground in the book itself. So the Articles of Confederation, let me just talk a little bit about the Articles to begin with, for those of you who are not that familiar with them. They were the first constitution for the United States. They were adopted in 1781 toward the close of the Revolutionary War. They created a central government that was a loose affiliation of the 13 states. The Articles provided that the central government had very limited powers, primarily over peace and war. They created a one-house Congress. Each state had one equal vote in Congress. There was no separate executive as such as a president that we have now, and there was no separate judiciary. Congress was really intended to be the governing body for the Confederation. Confederation fiscal and military legislation had to be adopted by a vote of at least 9 states. Remember, there were 13 states, and what that meant was that any one section of the country could probably block most fiscal and military legislation if it was unhappy about it. The Confederation had no tax powers. Instead, if it needed money, it had to ask the states for it. Congress would send each state a bill called a requisition that required the state to pay its share of money to cover United States expenses, such as the Army. And the Confederation had very, very limited commerce powers. One final feature of the Confederation you should know about is that any changes to its powers required the consent of all 13 states. If any one state objected, the Confederation could not receive new or different powers. Now, in 1783, many people thought the Confederation was the perfect central government for a republic composed of a series of state republics. All in all, it was a government that intentionally protected popular liberty by making it virtually impossible to create a tyrannical central government. Most Americans saw the British Empire at the time as the prime example of oppressive government. They wanted to avoid copying it at all costs, and the Confederation was the result. Now, the Confederation had governed the United States during the Revolutionary War. To many people, it seemed that the United States had triumphed gloriously in the war. But if we look more closely at the war, we can see that victory had been purchased at a very high price. The Revolutionary War was exceptionally costly to the United States in both human and economic terms. Historians estimate that in the war, 25,000 to 35,000 American soldiers died in battle, in prison, of disease, or of wounds. By way of comparison, that would be the equivalent of 3 million Americans dying today. So you can see that the war had a very large impact throughout American society. It caused widespread misery. By its end, thousands of families had had their lives permanently disrupted by its harsh realities, including death, disability, rape, separations, flight, and impoverishment. Some families lost more than one member in the war. Mary Jones wrote to her brother from South Carolina that both of her sons had been killed by the British before she was driven away. She wrote, "I was very much distressed." The war caused significant infrastructure damage and major economic losses as well. Entire towns were burned by the British. A British officer justified the burning of Fairfield, Connecticut, including its churches, as a way to cause, quote, "a general terror and despondency," unquote. Roughly 100,000 British and American troops, and the United States has about 3 million people at the time, lived off of farmers' crops and goods, sometimes paying for them, but often plundering them. America's valuable export trade collapsed. At the end of the war, the Confederation was about $40 million in debt. In 1783, though, most Americans thought that the war had been worth it. After all, the United States was independent, and it had obtained massive new Western territories from Great Britain in the Paris Peace Treaty of 1783. Americans expected that they would quickly settle the West and become a continental empire. As one prominent leader, Reverend Ezra Stiles, wrote in a widely read 1783 sermon, "It is probable that within a century from our independence, the sun will shine on 50 million of inhabitants of the United States. This will be a very great nation, equal to half Europe." It quickly became clear, however, that these hopes would be dashed, as we'll see in a few minutes. Worse yet, the war was followed by a severe economic recession. Most economic historians today think that it was probably the worst economic conditions until the Great Depression of 1929. Consumer prices over the next several years actually fell on an average more than 16%. Land prices and rents also fell sharply. Thousands of people lost their jobs and homes as a result. Interest rates skyrocketed, and exports remained very depressed throughout the 1780s. One final economic fact you should know. State taxes went up sharply as a result of the war. They were often 3 to 5 times higher than pre-war taxes. Most of the increased taxes were intended to pay state or Confederation war debt. Both the economic hardships caused by the recession and these large tax increases became sources of major social unrest during the mid-1780s. The war also had important political effects. It democratized American society in a number of different ways, and it split American leaders' views of what the future should hold for the government of the United States. By 1783, some leaders thought that the Confederation had done a very good job running the war. They didn't see any real reason to make major changes in the Confederation. They thought that, tinkering would probably solve all future problems. And I'm going to call them Federalists, but with a small f, because they believed in the idea of federation that underlay the Articles of Confederation. They included prominent men such as Samuel Adams, the famous Boston Revolutionary, and congressmen such as Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, Arthur Lee, and Richard Henry Lee of Virginia. These men believed that giving the Confederation additional powers, especially the power of taxation, was unnecessary and dangerous. They particularly feared that central taxation would lead to and pay for the creation of a peacetime standing army. As Richard Henry Lee said, "For give the purse and the sword will follow." The army, in turn, would foster rule by an aristocracy or even a new monarchy, in these men's view. That explains why Massachusetts political leader Tristram Dalton wrote to Congressman Elbridge Gerry, quote, "Can it be supposed that the people of the northern states can ever admit without horror the idea of consequences naturally flowing from a standing army?" He continued, "If any of the United States acquiesce in this scheme, they are formed for slaves." So you can see they felt extremely strongly that taxation would lead to a standing army, and for that reason alone, it was essential to oppose granting the central government power over taxation. Other leaders, however, felt by 1783 that the Confederation had done a poor job of conducting the war. They believed, and Hamilton would be an example, that it needed major reforms to be an effective government. I will call them nationalists because this is the traditional terminology that's used. They included George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and many prominent military veterans, many of the generals who had run the war, and merchants. Washington in particular had very strong feelings about the need for reform. As he wrote, quote, "No man in the United States is or can be more deeply impressed with the necessity of a reform in our present Confederation than myself. For to the defects thereof and want of powers in Congress may justly be ascribed the prolongation of the war. More than half the perplexities I have experienced in the course of my command, and almost the whole of the difficulties and distress of the army, have their origin here." So Washington really saw the Confederation government as having prolonged the war, which meant that more soldiers had died and more people had been pulled away from their families unnecessarily. He was very, very unhappy about the Confederation. From 1783 onward, Washington and many other nationalists were convinced that if the Confederation was not fundamentally reformed to give it greater powers, such as taxation, the Union would eventually collapse. And understand this is a critical point. Washington was firmly convinced by the end of the war that unless the government was made stronger, it was just a question of time until the United States fell apart. If that happened, smaller regional confederations would then form. And we know that during this period, serious consideration was given in different parts of the country to setting up smaller confederations. Because they would inevitably be weaker, in Washington's view, the United States would either be invaded or these small confederations would begin a civil war against each other with the result that a dictatorship might be created. Federalists, on the other hand, denied that this kind of danger existed. Now let's turn to the Confederation and the states and see how they dealt with the post-war problems they confronted in this turbulent political and economic climate that was created by the war. The Confederation's overarching problem was its massive war debt, which was about $40 million at the time. Almost everybody agreed that the debts needed to be paid, but they disagreed about how they should be paid. Some people thought that the Confederation requisition system would work. Other people wanted to sell national lands, and another group wanted to give the Confederation tax power. As events turned out, the Confederation requisition system was a complete failure. The states paid about 30% of the money that Congress asked them to pay during the period from 1781 to 1787. As a result, the Confederation ran a deficit throughout that period, and the national debt grew throughout that period. So the Confederation's requisition system wasn't going to work. Congress then asked the states to agree to give the Confederation limited tax powers, power to impose a 5% import tax, and an agreement that each state would supply a fixed amount of money to Congress each year. For the next 4 years, the states fought about whether or not they were willing to give this power to Congress. And as it turned out, several states were making money off of the fact that Congress did not have tax power. New York State in particular had its own import tax, and it was providing more than half the money in the New York budget, and a lot of it was being paid by people from Connecticut and New Jersey. So New York loved having a state import tax, and it was going to lose that tax if Congress got import tax power. So the New York legislature refused over and over again to allow Congress to be given any import tax power. And very few of the states were willing to provide the supplemental taxes that Congress had asked for. I don't have time today to talk about the fact that it also was a complete failure to try to sell the Western lands that the United States had. The expectation that that would work at the time was unrealistic to begin with, but Native American resistance, among other things, was a significant part of the reason why very little money was raised that way. But Western migration continued during the time that this was going on. And to give you an example of how massive this migration was, by 1790, the frontier areas that now comprise the states of Kentucky and Tennessee alone had more than 100,000 residents, which meant they had a population nearly as large as the states of Rhode Island and Delaware combined. So this is a massive movement of people that begins immediately after the war. And some of this migration is legal, and some of it is people squatting on Confederation lands, and the Confederation can't do anything about it. And the leaders in the East are uniformly concerned about this westward migration because they're losing tax revenue to people who are never going to be paying taxes in the West, and they're very concerned that these people are going to break off from the United States and become part of either the British Empire or the Spanish Empire, which is exactly what Britain and Spain want to have happen. And the reason that we know this is what they want to have happen is they're providing covert military aid to Native Americans who are resisting westward expansion. And so their first choice is to make sure that the United States can't expand westward. And failing that, they want to do what the Spanish did, and that is to try and bribe American leaders so that they'll become part of the Spanish Empire. So, as I say, there's a massive westward migration moving. Congress can't agree what to do about it. Congress can't control it. Leaders are very concerned about it. The British went beyond just providing military aid. They kept their forts in the West and allowed the Native American tribes to use them as military bases, which was very, very helpful. In fact, American Army leaders were convinced that as long as the British kept the forts, the Native Americans would never honor a treaty with the United States because they were always going to be able to continue military resistance. So this is all going on at the same time that the Confederation is going broke. The Spanish, however, I think have the cleverest plan for how to resist American expansion. Here's what they do. In 1784, they announced that they're closing the Mississippi River. You know, just a small western river that nobody really particularly cares about. They're going to close it to Americans. Not to anybody else, just to Americans, okay? And then they do what I think was a really, really shrewd thing, and they send Don Diego Garcia to the United States with authority to negotiate a trade treaty. And the way the trade treaty will work is that the United States will be allowed to sell fish and things like that to Spain as long as it agrees that the Mississippi River will stay closed to Americans. So Garcia shows up, and the New England congressmen think this is a great plan. They don't want people migrating west to begin with. They really want to sell fish to Spain, right? So for them, there's nothing to lose and everything to gain from this plan. Meanwhile, Patrick Henry, the governor of Virginia, most of the South realized that if the Mississippi River remains closed, it is pointless to expand to the Southwest because you cannot run a profitable farm if you cannot ship the products down the Mississippi River. So this splits Congress in two, and Congress holds a dozen separate votes that break down on completely sectional lines over the treaty. And this impasse, which finally takes place in 1786, is still occurring when the Philadelphia Convention meets, and the river is still closed when the Philadelphia Convention meets, and the Confederation cannot do anything whatsoever about this. Okay? So, to quickly summarize, the Confederation ran into a series of major problems and was really unable to combat them, either because of sectional conflict, of which there were massive amounts during this period, or because of state self-interest. Meanwhile, in the states, economic conditions are such that there are massive popular demands for economic relief. Today I won't have time to go through this in detail, but suffice it to say that there was tax relief granted, there was debt relief granted. Several of the states printed paper money, and some of that became enormously controversial because it caused near riots in Rhode Island, at least. But the states, by and large, granted economic relief. The big exception was Massachusetts, where the Massachusetts legislature just knew better. It did not think that it needed to provide any economic relief, even though the farmers in western Massachusetts were probably, had probably the worst economic conditions of anyone in the country, and many of them were Revolutionary War veterans. So they decided that they were going to block the courts from operating, and that became Shays' Rebellion, which also took place in 1786. And they effectively shut down the Massachusetts court system, which meant the government couldn't collect taxes, private creditors couldn't collect debts, and eventually the state sent troops in to quell the rebellion. It wasn't difficult to do, but it really, really bothered the Massachusetts conservatives, because up until then, they believed that if the legislature told people that the law was X, that people were going to do X. That's what it meant to be part of a republic, is that you obeyed the law. And so when they realized that if the government's policies were unpopular enough, there might be an armed rebellion and that they might not be able to do anything about it, they decided they needed a stronger central government. And so the Massachusetts legislature went from opposing the Philadelphia Convention to supporting the Philadelphia Convention. And in New England, Shays' Rebellion was probably very influential. In the South, things were quite different. There, people like Patrick Henry didn't want a stronger Confederation, but other people were very concerned about the fact that Western expansion was blocked and that they were being subjected to Native American attacks. So they also supported a stronger central government, but for completely different reasons. Okay, now, this sort of summarizes where things stood at the time that the Philadelphia Convention began. And what I want to talk about in the last part of the talk is how the Constitution addresses the problems that the Confederation had. Okay? Because that's really what the Constitution is intended to do. First and foremost, it's intended to be a direct response to the failures that people thought characterized the Confederation. Because at this point, and I should just say before I start talking about the Constitution itself, there was a very, very long list of Confederation failures, to the point where Congressman Rufus King, who was one of the opponents of the Philadelphia Convention, wrote to his colleague Elbridge Gerry, quote, "The people generally throughout the Confederation remark that we are at a crisis." And that's, I think, a fair summary of the way people felt by the end of 1786 about things. As I said, the main causes of failure were sectional conflicts, state self-interest. And very important to realize that this means the Confederation could not have avoided its failures for the kinds of reasons that are so popular in the United States today as explanations for political gridlock. It would not have made any difference if the Confederation had better leadership. It would not have made any difference if there had been less partisanship between Federalists and Nationalists. It would not have made any difference if the Confederation had altered specific policies. Because when all was said and done, the Confederation's deepest problem was that it could not enforce its own laws and treaties. It completely lacked the ability to enforce its laws. And since the government's ability to enforce its laws is one of the essential attributes of sovereignty, it would be fair to conclude that the Confederation was not a sovereign government. That was George Washington's overarching basis for believing that Confederation reform was essential. The Confederation needed powers to enable it to be a sovereign, or it would collapse. And it's important to understand that this wasn't a matter of political speculation. Washington thought of this as the uniform lesson that you should draw from political history, that if you did not have a government that could exercise sovereignty, it was just a question of time until it would fall apart. As he wrote to John Jay in mid-1786, before Shays' Rebellion began, quote, "Experience has taught us that men will not adopt and carry into execution measures the best calculated for their own good without the intervention of a coercive power. I do not conceive we can exist long as a nation without having lodged somewhere a power which will pervade the whole Union in as energetic a manner as the authority of the different state governments extends over the several states." So Washington's ultimate critique of the Confederation was simply that it did not have the authority to enforce its own laws and treaties. And in the book, my book contains a whole series of examples of the Confederation's inability to do this and the consequences that that had. Okay, now, the Philadelphia Convention, which acted nearly unanimously, made a bold proposal for an effective national sovereign that would have full authority and the necessary resources to enforce its decisions over the objections of any individual state or section. The new government would possess independent powers over taxation, national defense, and commerce. The proposal also imposed major, some said devastating, new limits on state powers. They included a ban on state paper money and many forms of debt relief. Compared to the Confederation, the convention called for a national government that was almost staggeringly powerful. The radical nature of the convention's proposal shocked at least some, perhaps even many, leaders. It was an intersectional, elite, grand bargain. That is, a bargain that resolved all major outstanding issues in one package. Except as part of such a grand bargain, it is very likely that none of the major reforms sought by the country's different sections would have been adopted. Taxation wouldn't have been adopted, commerce powers wouldn't have been adopted. After all, the convention was held because piecemeal reforms had failed. It would unquestionably have been far less politically risky to propose a less powerful government. You often read today that the convention, the Constitution, was a form of a power grab, an overreach. And there's no question that the people who proposed the Constitution knew perfectly well that what they were doing was going to be as politically controversial as it was possible to be. So the question is, why did they do that? Was that an arrogant power grab by a group of wealthy men that was designed to protect their property? I think that it can also be seen as the convention's collective judgment that the political risk needed to be taken. And there were objective reasons by 1787 that made it necessary. To Washington and other nationalists, and to many other people as well, the dissolution of the Union seemed imminent. The country was experiencing enormous centrifugal political stresses at the time. They included state-free riding, Western expansion, European empire efforts to impede and divide Americans on trade, territory, and other matters, strong sectional jealousies flowing from severe economic and political conflicts, and increasingly bitter interstate conflicts over core economic issues such as trade, taxes, paper money, and debt. These mounting strains on unity and the Confederation's insolvency and persistent stalemates persuasively supported the nationalist belief that creating a national sovereign was imperative. Once it decided to create a sovereign, the convention needed to develop a proposal that could end stalemate government. Its solution was to provide for broad intersectional power sharing in the new government. The convention shared control of the government's powers by limiting equal state voting to the Senate and redistributing both House of Representatives and presidential voting power among the states according to population. That reallocation of voting strength made the new distribution of national political power a considerably more accurate reflection of the relative population and hence of the wealth of the states. That had the important effect of increasing the influence of the national majority will in the new government's affairs, which increased its legitimacy. Power sharing had several fundamentally important effects. It made it politically possible to confer major new powers on the national government: independent tax, military, and commerce powers. These new substantive powers accommodated both northern and southern sections' top reform priorities. As the book shows, in fact, New England and the mid-Atlantic states really were the ones who wanted the commerce power. The South actually feared and opposed the creation of a federal commerce power. On the other hand, the southern states wanted the federal government to have tax authority. And as we've discussed earlier, many of the states north of them did not want the tax power. And power sharing allowed the avoidance of sectional vetoes over the use of the new powers that had existed under the Articles of Confederation. Very important to understand that these new powers can all be exercised by majority vote. So you do not have the kind of sectional veto that existed under the Articles that required at least 9 states to support most significant proposals. The new power sharing arrangements, together with the states and sections' willingness to confer fundamental new powers on the central government, were at the heart of ending stalemate government. Moreover, power sharing also politically enabled the convention to create a new workable path for the enforcement of national laws. Law enforcement would occur directly against citizens in most cases. That meant that the new government would not have to undertake the futile effort to compel obedience from states, which had been debated for 6 years and which no one could figure out how to do, enforcing directly against states without starting a civil war. So the decision to move law enforcement of federal laws to individual compliance was fundamentally important to the federal government's ability to function as a sovereign. And that would not have happened. That would not have been agreed to by the convention without power sharing. The proposed Constitution's broad new tax and military powers, together with the changed path of law enforcement, made the new government a national sovereign with ample power to govern a continental empire. Washington had achieved his essential reform goals. He had been a private citizen during this entire period, but he never stopped believing that his experience from the war meant that the government needed to be strengthened. And really, this is, in a sense, his vindication. The Philadelphia Convention reached some compromises that were concessions to persistent state jealousies and state sovereignty claims. For example, under the proposed Constitution, neither treaties nor constitutional amendments could be adopted without supermajority consent. The southern states, for example, received enough Senate voting power to block any proposed treaty they opposed, such as the treaty with Spain. And every state received equal voting power in the Senate, a provision that cannot be changed if any state objects. These compromises would cause significant costs that the country would have to pay in the future. As I discuss in the book's epilogue, some of these compromises are still negatively affecting our government today. And as an elite intersectional bargain, the Constitution also protected elite property and wealth, not just creditors' rights, but property in slaves. Patrick Henry attacked the Constitution in the Virginia Ratifying Convention by arguing that its supporters had imperial ambitions. They were just like the British, Henry said. Henry said they believed that, quote, some way or other we must be a great and mighty empire. We must have an army and a navy and a number of things, unquote. Americans, Henry argued, had traditionally believed that the main object of government was to protect liberty. But now, he said, quote, the American spirit, assisted by the ropes and chains of consolidation, is about to convert this country to a powerful and mighty empire. Though many people agreed with Henry, the failures of the Confederation and the states had caused Americans to reconsider the balance between liberty and order. The Constitution was the result. The Constitution created a government that could foster and protect Western expansion. America's drive westward had some tragic results, especially for slaves and Native Americans. But the Constitution also created a government that was powerful enough to protect the Union, excuse me, under Abraham Lincoln's guidance when Southern states insisted in 1860 that they had the right to secede. The Confederation could never have won the Civil War and ended slavery as the Union did. For enabling that victory for freedom alone, we should cherish the Constitution, even as we work to correct its flaws. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer questions, but I need to ask you, if you'd like to ask a question, you have to come to one of the microphones. There's one here, and there's one over here, and the reason for that is that this is being closed captioned, and the closed caption people can't do the closed caption work if they can't hear you. So anybody who'd like to ask a question, feel free, but please use a microphone. And by the way, I'm happy to stay here as long as you want to answer questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. A fascinating talk, and so many details to it that I feel I'm going to have to read your book.
Well, I hope you'll find that the book supplies all the detail you need.
One point, though, that I didn't hear enough about just now was the issue of land ownership, land rights, and you said there was a massive recession. The usual result of recessions is that debt on farmland, et cetera, crashes the farmer's ability to continue to own it. It's bought at that point by land is then consolidated into massive holdings by a small number of very wealthy landowners.
Right.
How big a role was this problem? I mean, I consider it a problem in the switch to the new Constitution.
I think you're right to describe the normal sort of economic process. A recession will cause land prices to fall, and they fell dramatically here. And there were places where you couldn't sell land for love or money. But the consolidation process that you're describing didn't occur because very often state governments granted economic relief of one kind or another. And because people, in some cases, abandoned land and moved west. But probably the primary reason why that kind of consolidation doesn't take place is that even the major landowners, many of them literally have no cash to use to purchase property, and the states are providing debt relief and tax relief, and in some cases, land bank loans to farmers to pay taxes and debts. So I think that the process that you describe is one that would normally occur. It does not seem to have occurred here. What you see instead is enormous amounts of unsold property sitting on the market because nobody particularly wants to buy them. And every time somebody heads west, it gets that much harder to sell the property to anybody else, because most people thought that there was better land west, and they weren't going to have to pay any taxes if they went there. You know, the people who moved to Kentucky, the Western District of Virginia at the time, they didn't pay any taxes. So they not only got fresh land, they didn't pay Virginia taxes. So if they were facing foreclosure or something like that, in a lot of cases, people just said, we're moving. So, but good question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, let me ask you a question. I want to thank you first very much for a very interesting talk. I'm not from the United States, I'm from the Caribbean. How do you think, although in the talk you kind of went back and forth between the two, I'm talking the Confederation and the US Constitution, right? And the factors that led to, in essence, the very foundation of the United States of North America, right? How do you think that some of the inherent problems that existed during the time of the Confederation, right, continues at present to haunt the Constitution? That's the first question. The second question is, obviously, during this time, my part of the world, the Caribbean played certainly a significant role. I mean, we know Haitians came up and fought, other countries came up and fought, et cetera, et cetera. But also, what became extraordinarily apparent to the United States at that point in time, to the founding leaders, right, was how important trade was with the Caribbean, in essence, to bail out the United States when, you're facing basically what Cuba faced from the United States, economic boycott, right?
Yes.
How do you see all of these things continue to play into, and with the notion, for example, Jefferson pointed out that in 1783, don't hold me to it, but I think it's 1783, Jefferson pointed out that the United States need an empire, not the empire, a hemisphere to itself. I'm part of that hemisphere, right?
Yes.
I'm part of the people who are oppressed in that hemisphere, although I come from a reasonably well-to-do family in the Caribbean. But how do you see these things playing out and hunting what is going on at present? And do you see, in a way, going back to all the different discussions to get ourselves out, to get the United States out of that? Thank you very much.
Well, those are great questions. And in fairness to other people who want to answer questions, I'm going to try to answer the first question, and you and I can talk about the second question later, if that's all right. On the first question, my book is an effort to provide people with the tools that they can use to make their own judgments about how the conditions in the 1780s compare to conditions today. In other words, the book really has two purposes. One is to tell the story of what happens in the 1780s, but the other is to show people how to analyze conditions today that seem to them to be similar. As a historian, my job is really to do the first of those two things. And so in the book, I give, in the epilogue, I give one specific example of the kind of issue you're talking about. And it is equal state voting in the United States Senate. The basic principle that the Constitution adopts for allocating power is that it should bear some reasonable relationship to either the wealth or the population of the areas that are exerting the power. So that, you know, if you think of a monarchy, for example, as being the exact opposite of that principle, one person gets to make all the decisions for an entire society, whether or not the society has all the wealth and population, right? The United States Constitution says, no, we're going to abandon that idea as a legitimate form of political representation. We think power should be reasonably related to either wealth or population, which at the time in the 1780s were roughly the same thing. Population was pretty much synonymous with wealth. We still have that provision in the Constitution today. Every state gets the same vote in the United States Senate, 2 equal votes, right? In 1787, when that provision was adopted, the largest state, Virginia, was roughly 12 times as large as the smallest state, Delaware. Today, the largest state, California, is roughly 65 times as large as the smallest state, Wyoming. I don't see how you can defend the continuation of equal voting for all states. I don't see how you can defend it as being consistent with the underlying principle of representation that I think the Constitution is intended to adopt. That's my own personal view. I'm sure I could find plenty of people, especially in places like Wyoming, who would insist that I was, you know, completely wrong about that. But here's what I think, and this is what I say in the epilogue. This is the kind of thing that Americans need to start giving serious thought to, because the reason for the Constitution was that people thought the country was going to fall apart if we didn't fix some of the things that were not getting addressed in American conditions at the time. The same thing is true today. We have a choice as a country. We can either start to fix and address the core problems we have as a country, or we can keep blaming other people for them. I think the Constitution today, in some ways, not at all, in all ways, but in some ways, it's part of the problem. And whether you agree with me or not, I think we all owe it to each other to give some serious thought to whether or not we can defend the continuation of some of the principles in a document that is, after all, at this point, 230 years old. Because as brilliant as it was as a solution to the problems of the time, today's country is 100 times larger in population than the country that was when the Constitution was created. We need to really take seriously the idea that it's a different world. So that's my answer to your first question. And as I say, I'll be happy to talk with you. I think the broader, to be honest, just to kind of quickly summarize an off-the-cuff response about the Caribbean, you're absolutely right that the Caribbean became strategically really important, not just to the United States, but to Britain as a result of the revolution. And Caribbean slavery became critically important to both groups of people. And the United States, once it began to create a continental empire, and once it began to expand to the point where it was pressing up against Mexico, for example, there was going to be tension between that and a desire for hemispheric dominance. So in a sense, if you took the really long view, you would say that creating a continental empire was a problem for places like the Caribbean, because it meant that sooner or later that continental empire was going to try to expand its reach. But we can talk more about that afterwards. Next question.
Most people today, when we think of the Articles of Confederation, we don't see a reason why that would even be considered as workable. It just seems insane whether the existing Constitution is workable or not. Did that Articles of Confederation come out of whole cloth, or did we actually base it on models that had some success rate somewhere else?
That's a good question, and I certainly understand your skepticism, because we've lived under an alternative model for a couple hundred years now. But let me just say that at the time, many people were convinced that it wasn't just workable, but that it was the essence of republicanism, because their theory was that the states were republics and that they would meet in a Congress that was a sort of a council and debate national policy. And then they fully expected that after that debate, the states would follow Congress's decisions, because they had a rational view of politics. They thought that political virtue meant that you met in political debate, you made decisions on an agreed on set of rules, and then people would then follow them. What happens during this period is that belief about the way politics works essentially falls apart. And becomes seemingly less rational. But it's important to take seriously the fact that there was an alternative conception of what politics should be that informed the Articles of Confederation. As to your question about track records, there were federations. Historically, literally, some people would say that the first federations were found in ancient Greece. So they've been around for a long time as an idea. There have always been people who said this can't ever work, and there have always been people who said this is the best possible way to arrange a government so that you protect freedom for the component units of the government. So realistically, I think you could say that every empire, whether it's the Prussian Empire or the British Empire, over time has had to come up with some version of federalism, some deference to local rules, customs, local power, and the degree to which that occurs is very often a function of when an empire is created and what its component units are. So the Prussian Empire ends up looking different than the British Empire, but the notion of federation, the notion that you should be able to create a larger unit that nevertheless respects the autonomy of the smaller units, is an idea that's been around for an extremely long time. And all I can really tell you is that the practical experience of this period showed that this version of that wasn't workable. And the book really tries to give specific reasons why that was the case. And sectional conflict is a big part of the problem. You can't really have people sort of agreeing on policy if they believe that what's happening is sort of sectional aggression from one section to the other, which is what people thought was happening here. I mean, the South, for example, wouldn't entertain a commerce power because they were convinced that the northern states, which controlled the shipping industry, would exploit them if it ever got a commerce power. So it's kind of hard to have a federation work in a situation where there are really strong divisions, economic divisions between sections of one kind or another. I hope that answers your question. It's not, James Madison was an expert on Confederation, the history of confederations, and actually wrote a lot about it if you're interested. I don't really claim to be. I just tell you how this one worked, and my answer is it didn't. So, next question.
Thank you very much. This has been fascinating. I have a question really about slavery.
Yes.
And I see maybe you're answering it in some of your other books, but I was
Go ahead.
I was a little puzzled that it was rather late in your talk that you talked about how the the new Constitution protected slavery.
Right.
And you didn't seem to emphasize that debate between the North and the South, or those who were supporting slavery and those who thought that America could possibly have slaves based on, liberty and justice and all of that, that was such a tremendous argument as well, tearing the states apart. And just recently, a few years ago, I heard a scholar define what the clause is, the preamble to the Constitution to promote domestic tranquility, that in addition to the British trying to help the Native Americans, they were also involved in helping slaves in their rebellions against their slave owners. And that was another problem that the Americans faced that the British were doing as well.
Okay. Well, those are certainly good questions. And as it happens, I am happy to be able to answer them by saying I wrote an entire book about that. And it is a different book. It's called A Slaveholders' Union, Slavery, Politics, and the Constitution in the Early American Republic. And actually, it was writing that book that made me interested in writing this book. Because while I was looking at the way the Constitution deals with slavery, and it does what I describe in the talk, it creates protections for slavery, legal protections, economic protections, political protections. It creates all kinds of protections for slavery. And while I was trying to understand how that worked, I also began to realize that although there were certain areas where the northern and southern states agreed, or else agreed they were going to go along with something that got done, as I think is the case, for example, where slavery is concerned. There were also places where they really disagreed and where there had been sharp divisions. So this book, in a sense, is an outgrowth of my first book. But I couldn't agree with you more that at the core, there could not have been a constitution if the Constitution had not protected slavery. There could not have been, because the South never would have been willing to enter into the Constitution. And in fact, just within a year or two after the Constitution is adopted, Southern congressmen stand up on the floor of the House of Representatives and they say, if we hadn't believed that you were going to give complete protection to slavery, we never would have agreed to this Constitution. And they're right about that. I mean, politically, I don't think they could have sold it in the South. Even if you'd sent a bunch of anti-slavery representatives from the South to Philadelphia, and they had said, really this is inconsistent with the American ideal, let's abolish slavery, they would have taken the Constitution home and it would have been defeated in every one of the southern states, especially Virginia. It would have been defeated. And in fact, Patrick Henry, when the Constitution comes back to Virginia, one of his major arguments against the Constitution is that sooner or later, some president is going to use the military authority during a war to abolish slavery. And people said, that can't ever happen. That's never going to happen, okay? Henry was dead right, because that's what Abraham Lincoln did, okay? So it was an important issue. It was the core. As I say, in terms of making a political agreement on the Constitution, you could not have done it without protecting slavery. It just couldn't have happened. But this book, it really focuses on how we got there in the first place. How did we get to Philadelphia? And as to the last part, I've forgotten the very last little part of your question. About the preamble. I personally think that the preamble is what a lot of people charged Gouverneur Morris with at the time, which is he's tried to slide in language that he thought could later be used to prove one point or another. And there's no real evidence that early on most people took it terribly seriously. The one exception to that is the "we the people," where Patrick Henry jumps up and down and says, who gave the people who wrote this Constitution the ability to talk about we the people? It's the states that, that the government actually consists of. But with that exception, and my book, my earlier book, talks a pretty fair amount about the ratification debate and how slavery was dealt with in that debate. And in the South, people were told, it's not a problem. Slavery's taken care of. And in the North, people were told, don't worry, in 20 years we're going to wipe out the slave trade and that will take care of the problem. They were both wrong. That's my view.
Do I have to buy both books?
No. The good news is that my first book should be in just about every public library around here. And the last time I looked, it was in a number of the DC public libraries. Yes, sir.
Ma'am.
And I don't, by the way, if you can find a way to read my books without buying them, more power to you. Yeah.
I'm for D.C. statehood. As you know, D.C. has no voting rights, congressional voting rights that the white man feels bound to respect. And when Dick Cheney was vice president, Wyoming had 3 votes in the Senate. And I hold that addressing why is it okay that D.C. has no rights is the core of the issue of what are we really talking about, to form a more perfect union, to provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and what are the dynamics of how you change this, how does things grow? So if you want to solve all these problems, including the national debt and so on, why don't we talk about, really examine why D.C. still, the history of that, and why did we give Alexandria and Arlington back to Virginia in 1846, all these things. How do we get this discussion going, and what do you think about it? It should go and go and go, including Gorsuch's response to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, his ancestor Gorsuch. Why can't you talk about it?
The question was, what about the fact that the District of Columbia residents don't have the right to vote? I think this is an example of the kind of problem that I was talking about in my response to the earlier question. The agreements with respect to the district were made a very, very long time ago for what people thought at the time were sufficient reasons. The hope was to avoid having the district become a political football of one kind or another. But the point I want to make is today's conditions are different. And today we have a very different view of voting rights and who should be included in voting. I mean, at the time the Constitution was written, women can't vote, blacks can't vote. Sorry? Right, and so we now have a very different conception of what voting rights should be. So I think it's the kind of issue that should be re-examined, but I guess what I want to really leave you with is that what I think one of the key takeaways from my book is that piecemeal reform isn't going to work. People who stand up and say, you know, there's only one thing I want to do. I want to change the Constitution by repealing Citizens United because I think money in politics is evil, so we'll just have an amendment that will repeal Citizens United. I'm here to tell you that what my book shows you is that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. Because that kind of piecemeal reform, by and large, does not go anywhere. You can push it. You can get some states to agree to it, right? But you're not going to get enough support to actually change the Constitution, at least not in my lifetime, although that's relatively short at this point. When you talk about DC voting rights, for example, my reaction would be, you got to start looking at being part of a broader constitutional reform process where that would be one of the issues to be on the table. So, because I don't see any other way you're actually going to make it happen. Sorry?
It's a mindset. It should be the core issue from which the other things grow.
Well, but that may be true as a matter of sort of principle, but that's not true as a matter of politics. And if all you need to do is look at what happens during the period that I'm writing about, and you'll see the way politics works. Nobody wanted to come to the table as long as they thought they could get anything they wanted without giving up anything they didn't want. That was how it worked, okay? If I want tax powers, but I don't want commerce powers, then I say, like James Madison, give me tax powers, but oh no, people in Virginia do not want commerce powers, okay? And as long as everybody in the room is saying, just give me what I want, but I am not giving you anything you want, you're not going to see fundamental reform. That's my view. Are we okay?
Afraid we're out of time.
Sorry?
Afraid we're out of time.
We're out of time.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
And then, folks, remember there's a book signing one level up in the Archives bookstore. We'll see you up there in just a few moments.